So you've gotten off the Trump train, eh? Nice. Maybe you stayed on a bit too long and ended up at the wrong station. Or maybe not. Maybe you got off the train as quickly as you got on. Maybe you were a 2015-2016 diehard supporter, or you were a 2024 open-minded voter. Everyone's different, I get it. I remember a friend of mine back in 2016, a friend who's well-adjusted, successful in accounting and business, and far better than me at chess, telling me how he was on a plane and he chatted with a MAGA supporter back then who, my friend told me, made some pretty good points. The idea of an outsider coming in and shaking everything up was definitely one of the most appealing arguments to him, and I completely understand that. Our country, for all its good, has nonetheless been stuck in dysfunctionality in so many ways, and it's been screwing most of us over for a long time. Things get more expensive, our money gets less valuable, our country does egregious things, and we have to pay for it, while often not getting the most basic services required from our city, state, and federal governments. Sure, some famous outsider should come in and shake it up. The problem was, back in 2015, I think there were already signs that this Donald Trump guy was not really an outsider anyway, and more importantly, that his version of shaking things up was likely to be a pretty destructive thing. I wanted to make a video addressing former MAGA supporters because I think there's a lot of people who are starting to change their mind about the value of this political movement, and I like the idea of coming together with people who I may disagree with on many things, for whatever common goals we share. I know you and I may never fully agree on our political views, but I'm going to try less here to be convincing about my views and more to just look at how exiting the MAGA movement opens up plenty of space for conservatives to be themselves while still being constructive. I think there's an important conversation to be had about how people with differing perspectives can and must coexist, and where any limits to this coexistence can come from. Because at the end of the day, we're always going to have disagreements, okay? People can and do come to different conclusions based on the same information. That's natural and healthy. T.M. Scanlon, in his well-known 1998 moral philosophy book, What We Owe to Each Other, explains how we can understand people's differences in moral judgments not with some relativistic idea that everyone's equally right, but instead as similar to how experts in a scientific field can often persistently disagree on something despite having very good amounts of information and just interesting different approaches to that subject matter. Disagreements often exist between two reasonable people, not because someone is completely right and someone is completely wrong, but because our different approaches or methodologies lead us to different conclusions on a subject, or different approaches to knowledge in general sometimes. When we're reasoning out our judgments, we might, for example, agree on many reasonings, but disagree on how the reasons go together with each other, or which ones take priority. Our brains work differently, and also we're different more generally. Genetically, culturally, subculturally, with some people we're obviously less different, and with others more. And it can be often really hard to figure out whether a difference is fundamental, or if it's temporary, or even what the exact difference is between myself and someone else. This is true even with politics, where we might loudly and obviously disagree, but it might take a long while to figure out exactly why. For example, take an issue like the death penalty. I think the death penalty is always wrong, and killing is only ever justified in extreme cases of self-defense. But if you disagree with my position, is it because you have a different perspective on the role of the state, or that you have a different perspective on the changeability of criminals and wrongdoers, or you have a different perspective on the deterrence effect of the death penalty, or you have a different perspective on the amount of margin of error and wrongful conviction in the justice system that is morally allowable when weighed against possible harm prevented through the death penalty? These are a bunch of very different things, right? That could lead to our opinion being different. And it might not even be any of these. I mean, is it that we think differently from each other about these or other questions, or is it our difference is some kind of sensibility difference that we feel differently or react to our similar or different feelings differently? I mean, of course not, right? It's obviously not about our feelings, right? You and I are perfectly rational. We don't make decisions based on our feelings. What do you think we are, animals? Regardless, even as rational as people are, there's still the problem of, as Scanlon points out, the intellectual difficulty of the underlying issues and the ways argues that questions demand both imagination and careful, sometimes subtle, analysis. He adds, "It is often quite obvious that a certain consideration is morally significant, but far from clear what form this significance takes." This is specifically written about morality, but it applies just as well to views on politics, which are obviously connected with morality. Natural differences between people, along with the natural complexity of issues, makes it absolutely inescapable that any civilization is going to be balancing a diversity of opinions. It's a challenge, but it has its benefits, of course, because the differences in our approaches and priorities helps us balance one tendency with another, as we try to solve complicated objective problems as a mass of inherently imperfect and inherently biased subjective people. There will always be differences of opinion on the role of the government, the ideal relationship between the government and private industry, the separation of powers between federal and state levels, ideal rates of taxation, best practices for immigration policies, what's an inalienable right versus what isn't, and many, many other political subjects. It's fun and worthwhile to debate these things to a significant extent, but if I've learned anything from my love of arguing, it's that conversation will not resolve many of these differences, because the differences are often generated by unique predispositions and the unique experiences people have that inform their perspectives. So when do these differences between us really start to be bad and intractable instead of just normal and stimulating and challenging? I think it's when people are using excessively different information instead of just interpreting the same or similar information differently. What it means to exist in the same reality is to have some sort of vaguely shared similar grounding in something. We can't debate the quality of the film Men in Black 2 if you only saw Men in Black 1 and I only saw Men in Black 3. Of course, we'll never be exposed to the exact same experiences, and we don't need to be the exact same genetically or subculturally to understand each other in these ways, but what we need is to be referring to the same or similar things outside of ourselves when we talk to each other, including the same or similar facts. These days, with big tech manipulating the algorithms that influence the information we see online, and with the immense complexity of the information we want and need, it does often happen, of course, that people can become to some extent siloed in information bubbles. And this can happen on a macro scale in extreme political movements of many kinds. I know it's cliche to note this, but it's true. We can almost be living in separate universes of information sometimes. Take, for instance, the previously mentioned subject of the death penalty. You and I may disagree about, for example, what rate of wrongful conviction makes the death penalty morally wrong. Just starting with that aspect of the situation. We can have a lengthy debate about whether a 1% false or wrongful conviction rate is too much, or a 5%, or whatever. But if we start talking and one of us refuses to acknowledge the existence of wrongful convictions at all, even after being presented with evidence, a productive conversation becomes unlikely. Not because there's some moral line being crossed, but because there are facts being ignored and not enough shared in common to have the conversation productively. We'll never have entirely the same set of facts, obviously, and we'll always have many differences, but regarding relevant facts to a particular conversation, I think it's necessary to generally have a certain amount of overlap. We cannot live in a world of fully alternative facts, and when Trump's first administration let that phrase slip in the first few days, I think it was a revealing moment, as cliche as that sounds to point out. By the way, what do you think the rate of wrongful conviction is in the US for death sentence crimes? Take a guess. As a great example of why we should be humble about the complexity of the things we debate, after doing a bit of digging, it seems like maybe the process of determining a rate of wrongful conviction is extremely hard or even potentially impossible. According to this 2021 article I found that is apparently the first comprehensive review of wrongful conviction rate estimates, there are various statistical approaches people take, getting a range of results from around 1% to 15% for the most serious offenses. One 2014 article they included gives a conservative estimate of the rate of wrongful conviction of death sentence defendants in the US at 4.1%. 4 out of 100 death sentence convictions being wrong seems like kind of a lot to me. And this is the innocent people killed by the state, not including all the people incarcerated or on supervision on crimes that they were wrongfully convicted of. So, okay, let's take that 4% figure, which is close to the estimate between 3 and 6% given by by the article that surveyed all the different ways of calculating the figure. Did you guess higher than 4% or lower? And do you support the death penalty or oppose it? Studies show that the higher you think the rate of wrongful conviction is, the less likely you are to support the death penalty. And if you see statistics about exonerations and you read stories about cases of an innocent person being sentenced to death, you're more likely to oppose the death penalty after having those experiences of seeing the statistics and reading the stories. To me, 1% is absurdly high for innocent people being sentenced to death, and I'm also in principle against the state engaging in premeditated murder. People can still disagree, but a proponent of the death penalty needs to accept the fact of the estimated likelihood of innocent people being killed, and then they can certainly still say, regardless of that likelihood, it's worth having capital punishment. I could have some amount of respect for the disagreement as long as this person was being reasonable about their position and showing that they respected the facts that I am concerned with, like if they, for example, supported a slow and deliberate legal process that takes every reasonable precaution to keep the rate of wrongful conviction as low as possible. This would show that they were taking into account the facts that I was aware of and also my concerns. I would still disagree with their position, but we'd be playing the same game in the same ballpark at least. Republicans have always massively supported the death penalty in the US, and I understand many of those people won't ever be convinced. The least that can be done is to take the facts and the issues regarding the death penalty seriously and try to accommodate them. While supporting the death penalty far less than conservatives, liberals in the US are still around 50-50 on it as far as public support, with Democrat establishment actually taking out of their 2024 platform their call to abolish the death penalty for the first time in 2 decades, abandoning that position. Because Democrat leaders have tended to have zero spine and have refused to lead the people with any courage on so many issues. I'm not a liberal, by the way. I'm left-wing or whatever you want to call it, meaning I actually support improving society instead of just comfortably maintaining its dysfunction. I also don't want to bring society backwards. Now, I know some people might be thinking, why are we talking so much about this? No one ever talks about the death penalty. It's just such a weird and random political issue. There are so many bigger things going on. Well, I'd argue that the state's right to kill is extremely central to the powers we give our governments, and as we'll touch on, the first Trump administration carried out the first federal executions in 17 years, but really this has been a useful example of how conservatives and liberals, or conservatives and left-wing people, will always have disagreements, as will liberals and left-wing people, but how access to information and an overlap in facts can actually decrease the degree of political divisiveness. This has also been a good precursor to a very specific example of the difference between MAGA and conservatism that I'd like to detail for you here. Regardless of the fact that MAGA has completely and thoroughly consumed the conservative and Republican movements in the United States, I do think there are differences between conservatism and MAGA, and there always have been. And these differences have something to do with like decency, but it also has something to do with being open to facts. If you're a conservative, there's a chance we agree on a lot. We probably both dislike the government stepping on people's personal freedoms. We dislike wasteful government spending, lack of auditing and accountability of government departments, agencies, representatives, and contractors, and probably much more. But we also may disagree on a lot. Like, you may disagree with me on the death penalty, for instance, and if you support it, that's your call. In my opinion, it's odd that people who say they're in favor of a small government also support giving the government the right to decide to premeditatedly murder people, but okay, maybe you support it because you think an eye for an eye is justice or something Babylonian like that, no offense. Fair enough, we're different. But certainly there is a lot of space between being pro-death penalty and being pro-publicly calling for the death penalty in the middle of a media frenzy about 5 people accused of a crime less than 2 weeks prior who have not yet been tried by a court. Wait, what? That's out of nowhere. Hold on, what am I talking about here? In 1989, at the age of 43, real estate developer Donald Trump paid a lot of money to print full-page ads in 4 New York City newspapers calling for the death penalty, the toughening of police security, and yelling that civil liberties end when an attack on our safety begins. Which, I understand if you are a tough-on-crime person, but let me explain the context and the larger meaning here so you can see the avoidance of facts that I find very significant to the MAGA guy of Donald Trump. This ad was published less than 2 weeks after the very public arrest of 5 teenagers who were very tenuously charged with an assault that took place in Central Park, New York. Yes, teenagers. 5 boys, none older than 16 years of age. These boys were people of color, and the police deprived the children of food, water, and sleep before coercing false confessions under duress, with the media then calling these 5 boys the Wolf Pack, dehumanizing them. And while Trump didn't specifically say in his full-page ad that he was calling for the death of these teenagers, everyone who read the letter knew it was a reference to the Central Park jogger assault case that was all over New York media at the time, and Trump did actually mention parks in the letter, which he capitalized, because even back then, this ultimate capitalist didn't understand capitalization. The victim was a white woman, the 5 accused were people of color, and Donald Trump wanted to use and massively raise his platform by calling for the police to be unshackled in response to this crime occurring and the public attention around it. Also note that this time period was around the peak of general public support in the US for the death penalty, as well as a particularly violent time in New York City, meaning it was the best time for someone to try to raise their platform by publicly stirring fervor for the death penalty. When the late legend Larry King said to Trump at the time that his extremely public and unrelenting comments were insightful against these 5 people, Trump said this.
Well, I mean, I don't see anything insightful. I am strongly in favor of the death penalty. I'm also in favor of bringing back police forces that can do something instead of just turning their back, because every quality lawyer that represents people that are in trouble said the first thing they do is start shouting police brutality, etc.
Which he basically said also in the open letter. He never denied that his letter was about the boys, though when pressed on whether he was prejudging the case, he said,
"No, I'm not prejudging at all. I'm not in this particular case. I'm saying if they're found guilty, if the woman died, which she hopefully will not be dying, but if the woman died, I think they should be executed. I think you should have the death penalty. I think most people agree with me on that."
Was the ad careful to say if? Because there could have been a bystander, could have been someone wrongfully
you could write
arrested.
anything. I mean, here's a fairly long ad. It was fairly detailed and you can take any interpretation.
Despite the DNA evidence excluding them, 2 juries convicted the 5 boys a year later, and it would be 12 more difficult years until all their freedoms would be given back to them after someone else came forward and was found to be responsible for the crime. The 5 were exonerated fully and completely and ended up suing New York for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and a racially motivated conspiracy, which New York settled with them for $40 million in 2014. Nevertheless, Donald Trump has continued to say that the 5 people he paid to fan flames around were guilty, saying over and over that he thinks it was wrong for New York State to pay these men a settlement, adding irrelevantly in a 2014 op-ed, "These young men do not exactly have the pasts of angels." Do you see where we're starting to go with this being different than just being tough on crime? Leading up to the 2016 election, Trump continued being wrong about this serious case. These 5 people were exonerated. The DNA evidence always excluded them, as I said, and they were coerced by the police to confess in a tale as old as time, and the real perpetrator was caught. It's a case closed. But in October 2016, Donald Trump was still saying they, quote, admitted they were guilty. He continued not apologizing in 2019 and is actually currently being sued for defamation regarding his ongoing comments about these people. I know no one asked for this much detail about this one aspect of Trump's effect on the world, but I think it's a useful example of the difference between conservatism and MAGA, because I think that many supporters of the death penalty or tough on crime policies can understand that Trump's behavior was wrong when he's chosen to continue standing by false claims that whipped up a frenzy against 5 teenagers 35 years ago. By ignoring the very real issues in the criminal justice system, Trump led himself down a path of essentially delusion. The fact that he still says the 5 admitted they were guilty comes from, I think, the fact that Trump fundamentally does not believe in the concept of coercion. We'll say more about the consequences of that in a little bit, but I also think this is part of why he's a supporter of torture and thinks it works, which he talked about a lot in 2016. I'm not sure that torture would be justified even if it effectively yielded important information, but actually it doesn't. According to one scholarly article, torture cannot be employed with strategic precision, nor is it effective in enhancing security. The article adds, at a very high cost, the U.S. case confirms that torture does not work by any measure. Republicans back in 2016 were not that different. They also wrongly believed that torture worked, but Republican candidates tried harder to make it seem like waterboarding wasn't torture and that waterboarding should only be used sparingly, meaning they felt a little bit bad about it. Meanwhile, Trump was saying, would I approve waterboarding? You bet your ass I would, in a heartbeat, and I would approve more than that. Don't kid yourself, folks. It works, okay? It works. Only a stupid person would say it doesn't work. Believe me, it works. And you know what? If it doesn't work, they deserve it anyway for what they're doing. A good sign someone is wrong is when they give multiple reasons for something, and one of them doesn't seem to matter, apparently. Now, I think there's a fair criticism to my point here, which left-wing folks might certainly make, and saying it's better to have someone like Trump just come out and blatantly be honest rather than Rubio or Jeb at the time, who evaded or minimized while probably being only marginally different in their actual views, if different at all. Isn't it better for us to at least know exactly what a politician thinks? And while I agree there are benefits to Trump's obviousness and openness with his positions, this is a case where, like with his post-Central Park 5 open letter, he is publicly promoting a disregard for the rule of law and a disregard for any sort of empathy, a disregard for any an eye for an eye principles, and I think this is harmful to society. There's a difference in degree of the corrosive effect, and more brazen barbarity breeds more brazen barbarity. I believe just as we see public opinion shift on many issues, it's the job of our leaders to guide public opinion responsibly. They already guide opinion on many issues. They just should be doing it more responsibly and more in line with the truth. So if people want to support torture, yes, I think it's better for them to at least feel bad about it, because eventually those feelings will speak up louder and louder and the behavior will change, rather than becoming more ingrained by coming from a place of complete denial of problems. As a therapist, if someone has a bad habit, it's better for them to be aware of it as a bad habit and something they want to change or might need to change eventually, rather than fully saying it's a good habit. It's better. I know it might not seem the same politically, but I think there's some similarity to it. So in that first rise of MAGA, there were signs based on Trump's history and what he was saying during that campaign that his version of shaking things up was going to be more like a hurricane than a snow globe. I want to circle back to one point that Trump highlighted in his open letter and in his interview with Larry King, though, before we continue on. He said,
I said, of course I hate these people. And let's all hate these people, because maybe hate is what we need if we're going to get something done. I mean, it's incredible.
Now, if you want to hate murderers, obviously I'm not going to argue against that. Go ahead and hate them if you want. I just don't actually think that hate is how we get things done overall. And you and I can disagree on how the police should work, but there should be at least common ground that hate is not the operative factor, not the thing we need more of. And you might say, well, hey, he doesn't mean hate, he means retributive justice and punishment. And sure, again, you and I might disagree on whether a criminal justice system works more effectively as more retributive or more restorative in its approach. We might disagree, and I'm sure you've looked at all the research and so on. But surely we can agree that a politician should not have a history of literally promoting the concept of hate. It's just not a good look. It's not a poor choice of words that he wrote in the open letter and said in the interview. He just goes too hard on the retributive side and literally promotes hate. I mean, it's nuts. It doesn't work to make us safer, and it's outside of the Overton window of respectable disagreement in a civilized society. Like with torture, the Overton window is slowly shifting away, but MAGA has to bring us completely backwards, okay? And just literally be like, torture is great. Regarding the death penalty, I would argue that it's also outside the realm of civilized society for the state to kill anyone as punishment, but I'm willing to accept that since a lot of the country disagrees with me, at the very least our leaders should take the risks incredibly seriously. But I'm not really trying to convince you of my position here, actually. I'm just trying to lay out what I think are the boundaries of productive and reasonable discussion in an important issue like this. And I think this is indicative of the MAGA extreme on issues generally. entirely, where the rule of law is secondary to a retributive agenda. We need guardrails, which is why we have law. And law about law. Laws like mandatory death sentences being ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1976, which no one apparently told Donald Trump, who in 2015 promised this unconstitutional thing to his audience, as he's promised other unconstitutional things over and over, and tried to carry them out to whatever extent possible. Earlier that year, Trump had brilliantly pointed out to the New York Times that when someone is executed, you know that person's not going to kill again, which is a super good point, but you also know they're not going to kill again when you lock them in jail for life. Conservatives deserve a leader who doesn't corrupt their half of the political spectrum with the most poisonous influence. You can be tough on crime without reveling in the idea of police hitting accused criminals' heads on cop cars when arresting them.
You just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
Or take, for instance, this August 2016 example of Trump characteristically saying that the main reason there was crime in Chicago is police not being tough enough, echoing the same idea as the 1989 open letter saying to stop worrying about police brutality. Now let's take this one case with Chicago and look at it from the perspective of the Overton window I'm talking about. If we look at this one article about it, we can see the comments of the Chicago police spokesperson responding to Trump's tough comments by saying, the best way to address crime is through a commitment to community policing and a commitment to stronger laws to keep illegal guns and repeat violent offenders off the street. And though I'm not an expert, I would say that my position aligns more with what the article quotes as what experts believe, which is that, quote, a complex mix of factors may be at fault, including the city's undeterred gang problem and the proliferation of guns, as well as a long history of poverty, joblessness, segregation, and neglect in crime-ridden neighborhoods. So another way of looking at the same situation and identifying different facts as relevant to the explanation of that situation and therefore to resolving the situation. I would say that's pretty much the left-wing perspective, what the experts say, and I'd like to assert that the police spokesperson perspective is what the right-wing perspective should be in a civilized society, or something close to that. Donald Trump's focus on toughness is just authoritarian. There's no better word for it. In my field of therapy, the word authoritarian usually comes up in terms of parenting, and there's permissive parenting, which is bad. You don't want to let your kids do whatever they want. And then there's authoritarian parenting, which is bad because you're not letting your kids express themselves and have agency, and you're excessively telling them what to do and controlling them and teaching them that they can't make their own decisions by doing that, and so on. Now, in between, there's authoritative. Obviously, leaders are going to be authoritative. It's good to be authoritative, to say this is what's right, you know, this is what we should be doing, and so on. There are limits to where that takes you and to how far in the direction of the power of authority you go. Because authority doesn't just need to be tough. It needs to be wise, right? I mean, it needs to be smart. It needs to be specific. The focus on the toughness of the police as the operative factor in crime in its single-minded approach is authoritarian. The refusal to listen to other departments, to have inspector generals, to have people checking government power, it's authoritarian. It's not authoritative. It's breaking the laws and the rules to let authority do what it wants. As mentioned, the first Trump administration carried out the first federal executions in 17 years, and you may remember feeling incredibly safe after they began doing that again. Right. According to this article about the state murders his administration began perpetrating, Trump's old Attorney General Barr has said that he was the primary motivator of the executions. However, from his telling, Trump showed an amount of will and resistance we could only expect from someone with his history. Quote, Barr said he spoke to Trump just once about the plans. Regarding capital punishment, Trump asked, why do you support it? Barr wrote that Trump seemed satisfied when he answered that for brutal killings, it was the only punishment that fit the crime. Since this is like 30 years after Trump was running full-page ads about his own support for the death penalty, I can only guess Why Trump would ask Barr why he supports the death penalty? I mean, my guess, I would think that Trump was just trying to hear Barr's rationalization so he could use it in the future. But it's a little bit strange for a guy who for decades has supported the death penalty to ask why someone else supports it. Trump was the United States' most prolific execution president in more than a century and broke with a 130-year-old precedent by killing 5 prisoners during the presidential transition. Why kill those people rather than letting them live in prison? If you want to make some argument about money, I'm not even going there. Oh, it's costs less money to do the death penalty. First of all, I don't know if that's true, and also that's a terrible justification for killing someone. So, I mean, I'm not even going there. But my guess is that the death penalty justifies the state killing people in general and supports an ideological framework that benefits the state and those with power to get to use that power. They don't want to draw attention to the structural changes that are required to make a real impact addressing crime. People study crime, and poverty is a huge factor, and resolving poverty is not something that most of our leaders really want to do. Leaders want you to think things like the death penalty help, but it doesn't help. One article I found did a lot of significant analysis to find that moratoriums on the death sentence do not lead to more murders and actually lead to less of them. And from another article, I found out that when people learn that the death penalty is not an actual deterrent, they oppose it a lot more. As this one study puts it, our results show that participants presented with scientific evidence about deterrence theory show significantly lower preference for stronger punishment. This effect can be in large part explained by a reduction in the perceived effectiveness of increasing punishment as a means to reduce crime. When people are shown information, their beliefs change. But the powerful people don't often want this, because think about it, if they can lie to us about the deterrence effect of punishment on crime, what else can they lie to us about regarding the supposed effectiveness of the state exerting authoritarian power and control over our lives? On Trump's first day back in office in 2025, he made it a first priority to restore the death penalty and end Biden's moratorium. Biden didn't do any federal executions. He was happy enough to pay for Israel to kill Palestinians, but Biden did commute some people on death row to life in prison. The first sentence of Trump's order begins with the lie, "Capital punishment is an essential tool for deterring." It's a lie. This is a lie. I mean, so much of what they say is actually just lying. Sometimes it's like you would never expect that. You always think, well, they might be a little wrong, but sometimes they're just lying. You know what I mean? So imagine what other justifications for abuse of state power might be based on lies. Okay, we're done talking about the death penalty. I think it's useful to go into depth on one particular issue, but we won't be doing the same for immigration, healthcare, taxation, foreign policy, domestic policy, and so on. But I think you might be able to see how the pattern continues and how empirical facts are ignored in favor of an authoritarian focus on executive control. Like, look, conservatives, you can be against the education department, okay? Or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I think you're wrong, and we can debate about it, but we can debate about it. You have to accept that there are correct and incorrect, there are constitutional and unconstitutional ways to disband agencies in the government. Money is appropriated through Congress, and these agencies should be shut down through Congress if you think they should be shut down. This is just one example of how conservatives and MAGA can be different. You don't have to go full authoritarian just because you disagree with my political views. You know what I mean? Like, you can be a conservative, that's cool or whatever, but there's also still rule of law, essentially. Let's pause and take a new tack to the subject, okay? Totally kind of change of approach here. Can I ask you a question I've never gotten a good answer to? In the phrase, "Make America Great Again," what time period does the "again" refer to? I know I'm not the first one to ask this, but I've literally never heard a good answer. Is it to the 90s or the 80s, the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, the roaring 20s, the amazing 1910s, the 1900s, 1890s, the 1880s, 1870s, 1860s, 1850s, 1840s, 1830s, 1760s, the 1490s? What are we talking about? Seriously, I'm not trying to be pedantic. I refuse to accept that this is me being pedantic. It's a fundamental part of the MAGA slogan. It's the at the end. It's the MAGA slogan. So obviously, as you look to the past for whatever time we're hearkening back to, you are inevitably and unavoidably looking to a time period of less personal freedoms for everyone, essentially. I mean, sure, things go up and down, but the general trend has been increased freedom for women, African Americans, and all non-landowning white men, and so many other people. I mean, I'm not doing semantics about a slogan. This is indicative of the MAGA ideology, part of what makes it ultimately reactionary to a degree well beyond any reasonably ethical conservatism. And the MAGA ideology, led by Trump's actions and statements, poisoned our already divided country. For example, regarding racist attitudes. As one research article puts it, many scholars have demonstrated that Trump's victory influenced expressions of racial prejudice in the U.S. We build on this work by providing evidence suggesting that Trump's election had a polarizing effect on the expression of dehumanizing racial attitudes. And I know this is disturbing to hear, but specifically, quote, Trump supporters rated black people as less evolved in the post-election wave than they rated black people in the pre-election wave. Conversely, Trump opponents rated black people as more evolved in the post-election wave than in the pre-election wave. It feels gross even talking about this, but this was obviously not because of the MAGA slogan, right? The MAGA slogan represents a deeper issue. The birther conspiracy, the comments about Mexican immigrants he made in his initial launching of his campaign. I mean, there's so many of these types of things that create these effects. Anyway, this all led very predictably to where we are right now, where the rule of law is being stepped all over to achieve these unnecessary far-right ends of him and his most loyal cronies. The Republicans have all been infested with this because they're mostly opportunists and also agree with most of MAGA's platform, while sometimes, or at least previously, disavowing the most absurd extremes. I think Trump brings out the worst in people regarding sexism too. This 2017 study found that hostile sexism and traditional attitudes towards women significantly predicted voting for Donald Trump. And this 2019 study found that greater hostile sexism predicted more positive attitudes towards Trump in the same 2016 election. We can certainly imagine why, with many examples of him being sexist during the campaign, insulting the appearance of a political opponent's wife, gaslighting a reporter his campaign manager committed battery against, threatening punishment for women getting health care for terminating a pregnancy being some examples. And again, you can be against abortion, but if you're a conservative, do you really think the government should be ruling about that? Like, what the hell? But anyways, all that rhetoric about women radicalizes the public, and it heightens divisiveness overall while separating the more from the less extreme supporters. This 2020 study looked at the effects of people's exposure in 2016 to Trump's damning Access Hollywood tape where he promoted sexually assaulting women, and the study found clear and consistent evidence that respondents exposed to Trump's recording, relative to respondents who were not exposed to this recording, were less likely to express support for candidate Trump in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. So, like with the death penalty issue, exposure to information and facts changes people's perspectives, of course. The researchers found that Republicans were especially likely to reduce their support in response to exposure to the tape. Probably because Democrats were already very unlikely to support Trump, but still a good sign that people are malleable. I guess I just wish people didn't move on so easily or didn't forget about things so easily, because he did and said that, along with a lot of other things. I mean, it doesn't go away with time. Since then, Donald Trump has been convicted of sexual abuse, and there are many, many more allegations and accusations that exist. Very, very credible and substantiated allegations and accusations. I know that most MAGA supporters don't support Trump about this stuff. Most people just try to ignore it, and many successfully do. But it's not healthy to ignore things too much. And there are limits to what people can ignore. Right now, we're seeing the current MAGA base cope with the obvious duplicitousness of Trump, Bondi, Bongino, Patel, and all their cronies about the Jeffrey Epstein case. And it's clear that this is beyond the MAGA base's capacity to ignore or forget. I do wish that some of these concerned people were paying attention at the start of Trump's first term when he appointed for Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, who in 2007 oversaw an unfathomably lenient plea agreement that allowed Jeffrey Epstein to have immunity from federal charges when he was first criminally charged with sexual abuse of children. Then in 2019, when Epstein was charged again with crimes he continued and escalated since back then, Trump continued defending Acosta until Acosta had to step down. Why did Mr. Tough on Crime bring into a major cabinet position a guy who wasn't so tough on one of the most horrific crimes imaginable? Is it incompetence, or does it have anything to do with the history of shockingly close association between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, who said he was one of Trump's closest friends?
So how do you know this?
That was close to straight.
This seems to have a lot of corroborating evidence. They were photographed and videoed at events together. Trump reportedly flew on Epstein's plane 7 times at least. And it's been reported that even one of Epstein and Maxwell's victims was recruited to be trafficked and victimized actually at Mar-a-Lago. Maybe most damning, in a 2002 interview, Donald Trump himself said, quote, "I've known Jeff for 15 years, terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." So this is all disgusting, right? And it adds credibility to the idea that it was not a mistake that Acosta got appointed labor secretary after what he did for Epstein. It doesn't seem like a coincidence that Epstein died in prison under Trump's presidency without the justice system ever being able to function properly on his case in a way that might actually bring accountability to other associated wrongdoers. And I guess I just want to ask, as we sort of creep towards the end here, isn't it nice to be off the MAGA train? That must be so nice. I mean, it must be such a relief to not have to defend this guy anymore. I mean, he's calling his own supporters weaklings for wanting justice. You know how quickly I'd stop supporting a politician who called me a weakling? Hopefully this video has been helpful in demonstrating how Trump's concept of justice was never really a well thought out or substantiated concept of justice, but instead has always been the rationalizations of a wannabe strongman. All he cares about is for the powerful to be able to act on their power with as little accountability, limitation, or questioning as possible. I'll say before we get to a conclusion here, I understand hating Hillary Clinton, okay? I understand hating the Democrats, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden. They're all such swamp creatures too, implicated in all kinds of wrongdoing with very little ability to fight for or represent the average person. Very little inclination also. Neither Democrat or Republican establishment members want to confront their donors or go against private interests that influence them behind the scenes. And I think the biggest immediate issue is getting money out of politics so our leaders can better represent us without the enormous impediment of barely regulated industry lobbying. But there are still many differences between the Republicans and the Democrats, and my views more align with the Democrats for now, who I see as having generally more helpful policies. The Democrats face almost every issue terribly, but still do a far better job than the Republicans in respecting civil liberties and the rule of law. Thank you for listening this long to my thoughts. I hope it's clear that I mean well, and I just want people to listen to each other and respect each other and work together for a better society for all while accepting our differences. We all have family that we disagree with politically, right? Those same skills we use, hopefully, to love each other regardless can be used on a macro level. We just need our institutions to maintain some degree of functionality. We deserve better than the White House tweeting daddy's home about the president. We deserve better than a president with a meme coin that over 700,000 people lose money on while 58 people profit and he and his cronies make hundreds of millions in fees. We deserve leaders who respect investigative journalism instead of popularizing the phrase fake news as a device of defensiveness. Lastly, to circle back to the beginning, I understand the appeal of an outsider coming in and shaking things up. We've looked at how his version of shaking is less like a maraca and more like shaking a baby, but I also want to say clearly, Donald Trump was never, ever an outsider. Sure, he was hated by the establishment, but only in the way that someone can be hated who is actually very much part of the overall club, more generally. You know what I mean? Like, he was humiliated by Obama at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, sure, but he was there to be humiliated, because he was a famous media and real estate guy. Trump was born to infamous New York slumlord royalty and had consorted with and donated to so many politicians over the years, integrating himself significantly with all the swampiest of DC and bicoastal elite figures. I understand if the fame didn't turn you off, though. I think it's entirely reasonable to want someone who's famous to run for office if they seem to support your politics, because their fame will probably be an advantage, let alone someone like Donald Trump who's shown a continual capacity to benefit from the modern 25-hour-a-day media environment. Fame is a tool that can be used to various ends, though. If there's a famous person with a history of supporting the average working-class person, then they probably could learn the basics and run for office in a way that would be ultimately helpful, even if, or especially if, they shook up the establishment significantly. I've actually been saying this for a while, and I strongly encourage celebrities with good politics to please consider running for office and using their platform to advocate for changes that will be a net help to the average person. But Donald Trump was not known for treating the average person well. I think the Central Park 5 history is a great example of that, but there's also the stories about him not paying his contractors. Anyways, I'll end this message to former MAGA folks by saying I'm happy for you that you don't have to support him anymore. I really am. That's awesome, and it's cool to have differences of opinion with me, and I hope that the commonality can be our human side and the parts of us that respect others in general. And yeah, I'll say, I don't know how long you've been former MAGA, but as a non-MAGA person, it's pretty nice to not have to be surprised. I mean, it's still a lot of shocking stuff, but like, I'm not surprised when he and his, cronies backtrack on sharing the Epstein files, in any sort of remotely transparent way. And it's helpful, to not have to be surprised when Trump bombs Iran. You know what I mean? Like he just bombs other countries. He did that in his first term too. And he's obviously unable to stop the Russia-Ukraine war, to stop Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people. And it was always clear he was lying about his capacity for resolving conflict, in any meaningful way. There's so much horrific stuff that we're all witnessing every single day. I mean, if we're not shutting out the world, but it does help to not be surprised at certain things and to see patterns. It really helps to internalize and process experience. Right now in late summer 2025, as the reality of Trump's second administration becomes more and more clear and painful, and the consequences of his authoritarian rule and all of their authoritarian rule becomes more blatant and more broadly apparent, I think former MAGA folks are about to be an ever-growing group of people, and I say welcome. I hope we can all work together as best as possible to make sense of the state of things, and in the future, hold our leaders accountable. Thank you. Hey, thanks for watching. That was pretty fun, right? I think we all had a good time. I come on the camera here at the end and I say, hello and so on. I read the names of the very cool people who support this channel. We got patrons and YouTube members, so really amazing stuff here. But yeah, I also wore a red hat just to kind of bond with people, if necessary. I feel like if anyone wasn't totally bonded with me by the video itself, I wear a red hat. I show, some amount of hat-related empathy. And that's just something to consider. Okay, but thank you. Yeah, if you'd like to join these cool people who throw a few dollars my way, feel free to do that. You're a conservative, right? So obviously, you might have a little bit more money to spare. You got these tax cuts, right? Last few weeks, last few months, might be something to consider. But of course, you know what I mean? Consider your life from your perspective, money-wise, and Patreon and YouTube ship member-wise. You know what I mean? I would never want to tell you what to do. But I would like to thank all the cool people. So here, let's start with the YouTube members. Often I start with the Patreon patrons, and people get really upset. They say you're biased. I'm not biased. Thank you to the YouTube members. Thank you, Simply Snaps, 39% Weird, Pit Inhabitant, Hollow Moon, Jifa, Jasmine, Matthew, Ollie's Playbook, Little Mia, Miss Carey, and N. And over on Patreon, I'd like to thank the fantastic people over on Patreon who support this channel. User, MJ, Mr. Moxie, Miles, Brent, Madeline, Rabid Dog, Irene, Anastasios, Linguist Sam, Burrow, Ryan, Thulusaurus Rex, Luca, Gunther, Caleb, Scott, Redgrove, Ashley, Hugh, Ian, Molly, Platinum Sarge, Russ, Elemancy, King, Tom, Icelak, Noah, Matt, MK, Ibnomad, Miranda, XA, Perpetually Jackson, Noah, Simply Snaps, Francis, Aiden, Misha, Ofazo, Dakota, Garrett, Neural, Damage, Parker, Marrow, Grace, Helena, Raymond, Cedric, Standard, Taritsu, and We Live in a Society, which, by the way, that is true. I forgot to mention that in the video, but we do live in a society, and that's something to think about. We don't have time to talk about that further today because I think it's been long enough here, right? I've kept you, I want you to be able to go on with your day, your night, your mid-afternoon, whatever that is. You can watch more of my videos. You can watch other people's videos. You can watch the Verbal Journal podcast that I do. You know what I mean? I should have mentioned that. But the Verbal Journal podcast, check that channel out. Check out the pods. We don't get into too much politics over there. You know what I mean? So we like to avoid that. Okay, so great. This was fun, and I really appreciate your time and look forward to hearing people's reactions. And I had a good time getting back into the video essay game a little bit with this. A little bit of a return to form. I feel like this channel, after a while, I've been figuring out my next steps here, and it's been feeling really good. So I'm glad that I was able to make this, and I hope other people got something out of it. And I wish you the best. All right, well, that's about it. So goodbye.